Welcome to From the VC's Bookshelf, a podcast from TBR, the College System of Tennessee, the state's largest higher education system. In this series, we examine how we might re-envision the work we do and how we work together as we move into a post-pandemic world. Please join our host, Dr. Heidi Lemming, Vice Chancellor for Student Success, as she leads a live discussion with industry experts and leaders throughout our system.
All right, we're ready to get started with another podcast today. Excited to have Dr. Anna Esquivel here from Jackson State Community College. This podcast series for the spring of 23 is focused on themes from the book Failing Forward in Student Affairs, Using Missteps to Guide Next Steps, edited by Lisa Ettersby. The book is a compilation of personal stories from higher education practitioners, and all those stories have a common theme in that authors open up about professional failures. The editor takes a new twist, however, as Endersby states, the focus is on failure not as an action, but rather as an emotion, an identity, and a place where everyone seems to find themselves returning to over and over again. So in this podcast series, I'm interviewing TBR faculty and administrators to add to the collection of stories found in the book. Interviewees are asked to reflect on how missteps have defined themselves and became teachable moments. As the book introduces us to this topic, the purpose is really to have failure step out of the shadows and for our stories to be completely in the spotlight, to celebrate our effort over perfection and model a depth of courage. So success is personal, and so is failure. So with that purpose in mind, I invite you as an audience member today to fall forward with us as I talk to Dr. Esquivel about her personal journey in not only working with students, but in higher education and as a faculty member. And, just to give a little bit of introduction, and then I'm going to let you introduce more of yourself too. I first met Anna on a trip that we took a group of faculty to a conference to learn about high impact practices. And she was in that first group. She's always been passionate about learning how to better support students. I've appreciated her honesty in that work and enthusiasm. And she has grown into being what we call a high impact practice ambassador. She is now in her second year, really focused on study abroad, which I hope that we can also talk a little bit about today. Most folks don't know or understand that study abroad is something that community college students do, not just a university thing. So excited to talk a little bit about that. Anna has a PhD in literature and cultural studies from the University of Memphis, and really one of the things that I've leaned into with Anna is having her help co-facilitate some book club discussions that we've had at the system level.
So exciting.
Yeah, you were great. I mean, that's one of the things I was like, well, I've got to interview her too, because she's got great reflections. So with that introduction, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited for this discussion today. So give me a little intro. I mean, I'm not looking for, obviously, a resume here, but I'd love to have you share with our audience kind of your journey to get to this place where you are now.
Well, I think if you look at my resume, you will see that I am a spectacular failure. My failure knows no disciplinary or professional boundaries. So I'm a first generation college student. So I just had this mythos of college when I went as an undergrad. And I didn't really know what to do. I just knew that I was supposed to pick a major where I could get a job and make money. And to me, in a small town in Arkansas, that meant business. So I started undergrad as a business major. And 2 weeks into my college experience, I was sitting in a psychology class, and I was mesmerized. I thought, I had no idea that there's a whole discipline where you could think about these things and do these things and change the world in these ways. So my very first failure in academia was I failed being a marketing major because 2 weeks later I changed to psychology as my major. And it was just, it was such an eye-opening experience because there was a lot of nervousness about it. Just what does this look like? I was taking a big risk because nobody that I knew had ever done anything like this. Yeah, I mean, nobody in my family had gone to college and graduated college. And so I was really taking a leap. And so my first choice as an undergrad was, I failed at it. I was like, I changed it. Now what do I do? And so, and then, I go and I do, I finished my undergrad in psychology, and I go into graduate school, and I'm working at this really cool molecular biopsych lab. I'm doing some graduate research in psychology. And then suddenly I'm like, I don't want to do this. In a lot of ways, there were some personal failures and some struggles that I was experiencing. And so I left psychology, and here I am now taking a big leap into a completely different discipline. So I failed in psychology, I failed to complete. And then, here I am in literature. And then again, you have these, you don't really think of them as failures at first, but they are. I didn't get into the graduate school I wanted to. I didn't get the jobs that I wanted to, but here I am. I really love what I do. I'm sitting here with, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, on a podcast being questioned and really loving what I do and being successful in a lot of ways. But it was a result of all of these, sort of what you could qualify as failures.
Yeah. Or some would just say it's maybe a course correction. Maybe we all have kind of a purpose in life and we just gotta get there, but we don't know what it is yet, right?
Yeah.
Redefine ourselves. I mean, that's such a kind of a classic story. If you think about a lot of students having that experience going to college, thinking they know what they want to do, and then having their eyes open to other opportunities and switching. And probably most of us don't think of that as failure necessarily, but if you were really dead set on something, let's say going into something and you just don't have the grades to cut it and, and get into a certain program, what do you do? So when you're thinking about that and like how you now work with college students and you see maybe them struggling through that, what kind of advice do you give to them that's like personal for you?
Well, I think you have to, I think you're right. I think that there is a way to kind of redefine the idea of failure, but I tell students that you don't really have to, that I'm an English professor, so language is important and words have meaning, right? And failure has a clear denotation, right? A textbook definition. You were unsuccessful at something, you lacked something, you didn't complete something. And all of those things are true about what I did. And so I think that I don't really need to strike failure out of my vocabulary. I think that I needed to, and I tell students this, just redefine your relationship with failure. Failure is so important. Failure is absolutely part of the risk you're going to have to take to make change in your life. If you're not risking failure, you're not going to learn anything. One of the things so this is going to be a little navel-gazy here, but one of the things so a lot of people think I'm very right-brained because I'm, a literature professor, but one of the things that I love about my experience with the social sciences and what I have done with my degree in literature and in my teaching is how interdisciplinary my experience is. So one of the things that I learned that I took with me in social sciences, so I was such a statistics geek. I loved my stats and research class. And one of the concepts that I just fell in love with was the null hypothesis. And I don't know if you know what the null hypothesis is. And I want to really ask for forgiveness for all of my stats folks and friends and fellow faculty, because I'm totally going to mutilate this.
They might be listening. You never know.
Right. But the idea with the null hypothesis is that in kind of the scientific method, and when you're starting this experiment, you start with the idea, the null hypothesis is you start with the idea that there is no connection, right? That there's not going to be a connection between these variables or connection between those populations. and then you go from there. And so then you have an alternative hypothesis, and that's the hypothesis that you're going to test against that null hypothesis. The reason I love this idea is because in science and statistics, you start at failure. You just assume you're going to fail. It's like, probably not going to be right about this, right? So let's see what happens. And no matter what happens, you're either confirming the null hypothesis or you're confirming it. So it's in a lot of ways, failure is baked into academic inquiry. Failure is baked into learning, right? Because if you already know everything, if everything that you are learning is just something that's being confirmed, if you're not risking not knowing or lacking in some way, you're not learning. And so that's something that I really reflected on a lot based on some really big moments of failure. And that I'm not afraid to tell students and share with students, because I think that is so fundamental to learning, especially the kind of learning and the kind of risk we're asking students to take in higher education, to fundamentally unground themselves from everything that they know and everything that they're used to, all the ways that they're used to understanding. So it's important, I think, for professors, especially in higher ed, to be open about the risks that they had to take, especially being wrong about things.
Right.
And I think that's why I really love that idea, those concepts in science about just, even if you do fail, man, you've learned a lot,
Right.
that's publishable.
Right.
So,
Yeah, that's great. I love that analogy too with the null hypothesis. Well, I mean, one of the themes from the book is this idea of transparency. So I might dig into a little bit of kind of your childhood. So you are a first generation college student. A lot of first generation college students don't even think about, is it a possibility to go to college? So you talk about risk, right? So the first risk taking activity that a first generation college student has to take is going, right? Like they have no one around them that even knows what that is. So they're stepping into like this unknown world. How did you, I guess, overcome that as a first generation college student? Like, were there influences in your life that helped you to overcome that fear of taking that risk? Or is that just something that you have inside you?
I think that I'm really lucky in the kind of company I kept, as a kid, and this is going to sound so parenty. I'm not even a parent, but your friends are important, keeping people around you who are kind, who support you, who challenge you a little bit, I think is good. But I also had a really great supportive family. I also, come out at a time where nobody was shy about taking out student loans. So that's me, talk about a big risk. So I invested a lot too. And so I think we're really lucky, especially here in Tennessee, that students don't have to take that financial risk as much as we used to. But so I remember, and I tell my students this a lot too, I remember being so scared because everybody I went to school with, I went to kind of a fancy liberal arts school. So not only was it just, I was a first generation college student, but I was surrounded by people who had those experiences. They had parents with graduate degrees, that they were from communities that this was the norm. And so it was really scary. There was just a lot I didn't know about how to sit in a classroom, how to be. And of course, again, I was lucky that I had professors that really cared, that knew where we were coming from, I had friends who were really excited, to kind of get to know me because I was a little different than what they were used to. So, yeah, I think that there was that real fear that I didn't fit in, that followed me a lot. Even when I switched to graduate school in psychology, I was a little bit older than the graduate students in literature, when I switched, and I had spent so much time studying psychology. I didn't know as much literature. I was just behind. I was perpetually behind. And it was terrifying. And there was a lot of ego risk there. But I think that, it's easy to kind of look back retrospectively and say, I think I learned maybe a little bit more than people who were comfortable in that position. I had to work a little harder. I had to close the gap a little bit more. And it was terrifying, but I think it made me who I am.
Yeah, well, and certainly probably makes you a better faculty member now as you work with that population of students,
Absolutely.
and having empathy for the places that they are when they're coming to us and how you can adapt to support them. So, again, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about with community colleges is, again, this idea that students could even go beyond our state, our country, study abroad. That's another risky kind of thing, right? You've been involved in trying to encourage students to think about taking that risk and thinking
Huge risk, yeah.
globally, not just locally. So, from your vantage point as a faculty member, what do you see are kind of the challenges that maybe students are working through there, and like how you support them? And again, maybe bringing in this notion of failure into that conversation.
Well, one of the things that I tell my students all the time is, especially when we're studying abroad, is don't be afraid to get lost. That's how you really learn what you're capable of, what other people are capable of in terms of helping you, figure out where you are. So, and that's a big failure, right? It's like I am lost. I have failed to figure out how to navigate the city, but that's a wonderful, beautiful learning moment. There's a lot of things that happen in that moment. So, there's a lot of risk baked in, but those moments of failure, especially when you're, abroad, I think is some of the best, most beautiful moments. One thing that I think is really important to understand, and I want to talk about students in a minute, but I want to talk to faculty about this too, because as soon as you said something, it kind of triggered a memory and this idea of high impact practices. I think we could really easily call high impact practices high risk practices if you look at what we're asking students to risk and what they could possibly fail at, how big they can fail. And so one of my earliest memories and I share this with my students so much, one of my earliest memories is the very first day of classes. As an undergrad, I was sitting in an empty room and I couldn't figure, I was like 30 minutes early. And as the clock ticked, nobody was showing up. There was no teacher. There was no movement. I was just sitting in this room and I kept looking at, my printed schedule. And I kept just pouring of it's like, what have I done wrong? I'm in the right place. I didn't know how to read the schedule. It was the wrong day. And that is something that I have carried with me and share with my students over and over, because I teach Composition 1 and I've taught since my very first day of teaching Composition 1, which is when it's usually the very first college course, college professor any student is going to meet. And a lot of times we have students coming in late because they didn't know how to read the schedule. They didn't understand what Tuesday, Thursday meant, that or the TR or the MW on the schedule. And I try to share that with my faculty members, with my colleagues too, because I think if they never came from that experience, they might not have had it. But sometimes we're so far removed from that experience that we forget it. So I tell my students that it's okay to be in these weird situations because we've all had to be there. So I try to be really transparent with them. But I also am very transparent in the fact that I didn't get to go abroad for the first time until I was in my 30s. That's very late for somebody who wanted to spend her entire life going abroad. But it was, it was a big risk. It was scary. It was a financial risk. It was getting out of my comfort zone. But it was also the greatest thing I ever did. And I knew from that moment that I wanted to help people like me, students like me, not just figure out how to get there, but figure out what to do with the skills that I was going to learn once I did. And so I think that when you are, from the second you get on a plane, you're taking that risk that you're going to figure it out, that you're going to, we're asking students to do a lot in study abroad, not just do something for the first time for many of these students, but then also take an entire class, and so there's that learning risk, there's that moving out of your comfort zone risk, there's navigating, relationships and close proximity that you might not have in a traditional classroom. So, but that's my favorite thing. It's the personal aspect of that. Teaching is important, but to me and why I do study abroad, it's kind of very close second, because that first part is just, I love seeing the looks on students' faces when they say, oh my gosh, I can do this. I can do this. I can get lost in a city and figure out my way back home. I can, go thousands of miles away across the Atlantic from my family and be okay.
Right.
And they come back just completely changed. And I think one of the important things to do is to have somebody who can help them figure out what's happened. Not just say, you've had this amazing experience, but look what you gained. Look who you became. Look what skills you acquired doing this, and really having them process that and guide them through that kind of processing on that return, so they can really see what they've accomplished. And then they can kind of move forward with that. They know that they have these skills now that they might not have realized before.
Right. It's not simply taking a trip. It is an actual learning opportunity that transforms your life. And we hear that over and over about our students. And for the audience, I would just, emphasize, in Tennessee, we're very fortunate to have a consortium model that allows our students to study abroad in significant numbers. And people don't know that about Tennessee, that we're one of the leading states in the country for sending students abroad within our community college system. And we want to get the word out. And Anna's a strong advocate for us, and now as an ambassador for study abroad and talking with other faculty. What are you finding? Are you finding that a lot of faculty also are kind of struggling with this idea that maybe they haven't traveled as much abroad, or they're taking a risk to take students with them and they're nervous about that? Or do you find that a lot of faculty are really embracing this method of teaching?
I think more and more they're embracing it. There is still, and I think that it's interesting that you did pinpoint that some faculty are a little resistant to it because it is a big risk, and from a faculty perspective, not only are you doing your job, you're doing a job in a place that you might never have been before, but then you're also responsible for all of these human beings.
Right.
Talk about scary. But I think more and more, and I have to credit to the ambassador program. I think it has been a huge, huge help, at least from what I heard from other faculty, to say, I have somebody to go to talk through these things with, to help me through it, to prepare me for it. And the more prepared the more we can prepare faculty, the better that's going to be for students. So I think as we're building this program, I hate to say we're taking some of the risk out of it for faculty, but in a lot of ways, kind of like we're doing with students. In a lot of ways, I think what makes our consortium model so successful is that we're asking people to take a big risk, but in a lot of ways, we're providing them resources that nobody else can provide, which is directors from their home state, sometimes even their home colleges, their home institutions, who have been here, who know, who are planning, who are preparing. We have a great office with the TENSIS office, the Tennessee Consortium for International Studies, who are so well versed in risk management. Not to take all the risk away, but to make sure that what we're asking people to risk are the right risks. And so we have such a great model for, there's a little bit of a safety net because you're going with people who, you come from a culture you're familiar with. We're almost all Tennesseans. We do have some people from out of state who come, which is really cool. But we're all Tennesseans in some way. We're all college students kind of working towards the same goal. But we're doing that. We're taking that group and we're putting them in a very challenging, risky, amazing situation. So we kind of have a little bit of comfort as we're stepping outside of our comfort zone. I think that's why that model works so well.
Yeah.
And now having a little bit more mentorship and adding more resources for faculty and for students to be able to take that risk, I think is just really wonderful.
Yeah. So we have, kind of this failure conversation, risk taking, and then there's the legal risk, which of course is more so in study abroad.
Yeah, we're definitely going to mitigate that as much as possible.
Right. But we're going to promote the other kind of. So one of the contributors of the book mentions that failures like other value-based constructs, and that there's intersectionality between social, cultural, and deeply personal aspects of our lives. So thinking about how you've worked through failure, Where do you see that intersectionality and how you interpreted what was going on and ultimately how you deal with the situation? And I think that connects with what the conversation we just had about study abroad, because obviously there's that huge cultural piece there that folks are navigating potentially if they fail while they do that, study abroad activity. But how do you see those kind of three aspects for you connecting and shaping how you responded?
So I think, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw. I was totally, like, my background is Black feminist criticism. So every time, I'm just trained that every time I hear intersectionality, I gotta give props to Kimberly Crenshaw. Right? So, and I know that this is being used in a slightly different way, but I think that when I got to grad school in literature, I think I felt like a failure because I was changing academic cultures, very different. And I think an undergraduate experience, and I think this is especially true for, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. I think this is especially true for community colleges. That kind of liberal arts model, I think a lot of people separate that from, we think of the liberal arts and kind of our transfer pathway students who are going to go on to 4 years, and then we think of our professional programs. But I think that what we've forgotten is that there is a real value in the philosophy of what academia had originally tried to do with this liberal arts idea, and that is to engage students in as many ways and as many different ways with the world and with each other as possible. And so you really are, disciplines are like their majors are like their own cultures, degrees are like their own cultures. And so students are, from the very first, navigating those different cultures. I mean, that's kind of what I did as an undergrad is, I lived in this culture where I thought this is what it means to get a degree and earn money. And then I really went against that kind of way of thinking by going into psychology and thinking, I have no idea what I want to do with this. I just want to think about this. And then here I was, very close to a career in psychology and neuroscience, and then I dumped it for a very, very, diametrically opposed culture, academic culture. I think in a lot of ways, I like to use that experience with my students. When you're teaching a composition class, you have students from all walks of life, very diverse classrooms, which is what I like about teaching at a community college. You have people from every walk of life, every age group, every background who are sitting in your classes. And that's just the most magical thing to me. But not only are they navigating the cultures that they come from, but they're trying to figure out, what culture do I see that I want to fit into or that I need to learn how to navigate? They are taking personal risk because moving from culture to culture, right, transgressing those cultural bounds, even if they're kind of disciplinary or community boundaries, is a lot of risk. I mean, we have those classic cases, I think, especially in community colleges, where you have students who, they have family members who may not be supportive. They have partners or spouses who think that maybe it's a good idea, but the more they are embracing a different culture or different professional and personal goals, they're kind of isolating themselves from the old culture and their families. And so I really try to tap in to those same experiences, those experiences where I made those transgressions of boundaries, cultures, both culturally and professionally, and how it felt and how scary it was and what I risked and what I had to lose, part of myself or, maybe friends or just, professional acquaintances or whatever, to take those risks. And I really try to meet students from that place and say, I get it. It's scary. And let's see, when you're making these decisions, let's see what are some things that we might be able to talk about and kind of negotiate in terms of, is it worth it? It was worth it for me, certainly. But I didn't know at the time that it was. I didn't know it was going to pan out. So understanding what students are risking and what failure looks like to them even if we think that they're succeeding, even if we think, oh, you'd be, a success to an advisor is you've got to take that scholarship to UT. You've got to take that transfer scholarship to UT. But, all of your family is from Memphis. That might be a failure. Having to move that far away might be failing your family. Not taking that scholarship at UT might be failing yourself. But, trying to be understanding about what failure can look like and what it can mean and what our different relationships, personal, cultural, professional, social relationships are, I think it's absolutely part of our responsibility as faculty to help students to tap into that ourselves and to help students navigate those decisions too.
Right.
Those intersectional aspects of their lives and what different successes and different failures are going to mean and how they're going to transpond across those different boundaries.
Right, which supports what the book is about, which is our values and our personal beliefs this is about feelings and this is about the inner workings, not necessarily an intellectual activity always, right? So, so in our final moments together, I know you've had some time to really reflect on failure in preparation for this podcast. What other kind of takeaways did you have when you were doing that reflection that you would want to impart with our listeners?
I just find somebody, find a mentor. Let me say it like this. I think you found the right mentor when you've found somebody who's willing to say, I don't know. And let me tell you something, for an academic, for somebody in higher education saying, I don't know, big failure. Like we don't like to say that, right?
Yeah.
We're content experts. We're educators, right? We're supposed to have the answers. I think the minute you find somebody who is willing to say, it's okay not to know, and that is kind of the most exciting precipice of learning, is to say, I don't know, and to figure out, how am I going to figure this out? How am I going to ask the right questions? And I've had a lot of those mentors in my life who have just been willing to kind of set ego aside and say, I don't know, let's figure out this together. Or to say, and this was advice that I got going into my very first teaching experience from one of my professors in graduate school, was don't apologize for who you are, but don't be afraid to say you don't know. And that to me is just absolutely key to being a good educator, but also being a really good learner, is to be willing to admit you don't know. Because if you're not willing to admit that you don't know something, you're not taking the risk of failure, and you're not supporting the null hypothesis, or pursuing the null hypothesis. If you already know, then what do you think you have left to learn? So I think that that's really important, is being willing to say, I failed to know the answer to this. I don't know, but let's figure out how to find out.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for your time today in the conversation. I really appreciate it. And look forward to future ventures together, risk-taking together.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of From the VC's Bookshelf, brought to you by TBR, the College System of Tennessee, powering the state's economy and changing the lives of thousands of graduates, starting successful careers each year. To learn more about upcoming book selections or to register to attend discussions live, visit tbr.edu/bookshelf.